Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Reduce Risk and Improve Security Through Infrastructure Automation. My name is Jessica Seward, and I'm the Director of Demand Gen at ThreatConnect. I'm going to take a few minutes to go over some housekeeping items, and then I will introduce today's speakers. First, I want to let everyone know that phone lines are muted to keep background noise to a minimum. If you do have questions, please ask them by typing them into the chat feature on your webinar console. You can do that at any time during the presentation, and we will answer all questions at the end. Second, the webinar is being recorded today, and we will be sending the recording out to everyone who registered as soon as we have it available, probably tomorrow morning. So now I will introduce today's speakers. First, we'll hear from guest speaker JB Blankenship. JB is a principal analyst at Forrester. He supports security and risk professionals, helping clients develop security strategies and make informed decisions to protect against risk. His research focuses on security monitoring, threat detection, insider threat, phishing prevention, operations, and management. His more than 12 years of security experience includes marketing leadership and product marketing roles at Solutionary, McAfee, and IBM, where he focused on managed security services, consulting services, email security, compliance, and network security. His background also includes extensive experience in the IT, telecommunications, and consulting industries with Nextel, IBM, Philips Electronics, and KPMG. Second, we'll hear from Joe Reese. Joe Reese has spent the last 4 years as the integrations product manager at ThreatConnect. Prior to that, he worked with network operations centers and computer incident response teams across the DoD, intelligence community, and large enterprise. He loves helping customers mitigate risk and solve security operations challenges through technology, integrations, and orchestration. Joe is an avid outdoorsman and resides in Raleigh, North Carolina with his wife and children. So now I am going to turn it over to JB to kick things off.
Excellent. Thanks, Jessica. Really appreciate it. Here's a bit of the agenda that I'm going to cover. I'm going to cover a little bit of information from Forrester's annual security survey. We do a big security survey every year to security practitioners like yourselves all over the world to kind of figure out, what are they experiencing and how are they trying to solve problems. So I'll present a little bit of those findings and then kind of jump into some of the issues that we're having in security operations with regards to infrastructure complexity and how enterprise automation is sort of driving the need for us to also automate part of what we do in security, right? So then we'll get into a little bit about some of the inefficiencies we have in our current operational structure and how we can improve those. Then I'll wrap up and I'll hand off to Joe. So let's dive right in. So data breaches and causes. So we send a survey out to practitioners all over the world, like I said, and what they tell us is more than half of them experienced some sort of a breach in the previous 12 months. You can kind of see here from the pie chart how that broke down. Lots of external attacks, most of those being due to software exploits or web application type attacks. Another 22% being due to stolen credentials. So you can imagine credential theft is a huge issue where an outside attacker gets a trusted insider's credentials, acts as if they're them, and then uses those credentials maliciously. We also see about 23% of the breaches out there being caused by inside attacks or internal attacks. About more than half of those were actually due to malicious intent. That's actually up year over year, where we actually see people who are doing things maliciously inside the enterprise. About 38% were due to inadvertent misuse, just trying to get around policy, maybe trying to do something a little easier, circumventing policy, those kinds of things. And then there's also a bit of a combination of both. With the rest of this being like third parties giving up data, where maybe a third party contractor has access or some outsourcing's been done, and then they had some sort of a breach that led to a problem. And then lastly, lost and stolen, assets, leaving company assets behind, perhaps in an Uber, perhaps at the airport, perhaps somewhere else where they can be found, maybe in the back of the car, gets broken into, etc. So the weakest link continues to be vulnerable applications, sort of like what the last thing said, right? Web application attacks, software vulnerabilities, followed by things like DDoS, credentials, mobile malware, et cetera, et cetera. One of the reasons I kind of doubled down on this, the software exploits here as an attack vector is the speed at which we are now releasing applications and the velocity of sending those applications to different types of infrastructure, on-premise, data center, multiple, hybrid, types of deployments, et cetera, et cetera. It's really difficult now for security teams to kind of keep up with all this, and a lot of this is done in an automated format. It's not necessarily we're pushing software manually or something like the good old days, and this is now being done in a very automated way, and that kind of really increases the complexity for us as security professionals. If you kind of look at the data types that are breached, it's all the things that are kind of regulatory mandated, right? Things like PII, PHI, PCI data, and other kind of identifiable information. The one that's really interesting to me, though, is intellectual property. I've seen that go up the last 2 or 3 years, where up on this list, where intellectual property is being targeted at a higher rate. And a lot of that is being done by state-sponsored actors that are actively trying to steal secrets from other companies, other countries rather. I think it's something we've really got to pay attention to, because historically we haven't really paid a ton of attention to protecting intellectual property, because it's not protected by any of our compliance mandates, or and it's something we've really got to think about as security practitioners. One of the other issues we have is that these big breaches, like you see listed here, they're the result of months, if not years, of threat actors being active in an environment. That's how you get to these, kind of really giant numbers. You have a threat actor that's active in an environment because they simply cannot be found. So one of the things that we've really got to work on in security is kind of getting away from all the noise of the data that we take in and being able to go and find these threat actors and stop them in their tracks. If you can think about 197 days for a big breach to be detected, that's a long time for a threat actor to be active in your environment and kind of figure out where are all the things that are valuable to that threat actor. So let's get into a little bit of discussion around infrastructure complexity and enterprise automation. Why is that important to us as security people? Well, one thing, our infrastructures are getting really complex. We've got on-premise environments, we've got data center environments, we've got multi-data center environments, we've got public cloud, we've got private cloud, we've got multi-cloud types of things. And we have ownership of applications and infrastructure that has sort of transcended kind of our just IT operations, or the CIO's purview, right? A lot of these things are being pushed now by business units, and perhaps they don't necessarily have the same level of oversight that we had in probably the older infrastructures, and a lot of times, a lot of the new developments kind of being done that way, right? And a lot of these things are being pushed, through automation. So where we're seeing things like, configuration being, managed, through automation and orchestration types of technologies. And you can kind of see here, these are all different types of automation that are being used, by the business, to push applications, to manage workloads, to manage, enterprises across all of these different environments. This is happening, really, really quickly compared to where we were maybe 5 to 10 years ago. One of the things I've seen though is we haven't really adapted security to keep up with this level of infrastructure automation that other parts of the business are really starting to embrace here. And what is the biggest challenge that we deal with as security people? It's complexity. It's the complexity of these infrastructures. It's the complexity of where all of our data is now residing in multiple types, application types, multiple environment types. We're also struggling with things like tactical activities taking up a lot of time. not having enough people, the lack of staff there, not being able to find security employees with the right skills for the job. So all of these things kind of come together collectively and cause a lot of havoc for us in security. And we really can't handle this increased complexity with security's manual processes that we use today. When we're using tools like Notepad and Excel and Outlook and perhaps Slack or something like that as our primary way that we're trying to be productive, as our primary productivity tools in security. So my colleague Chris Gardner and I did a report a couple of years ago talking about reducing risk and improving security through infrastructure automation. And Chris came up with this fantastic graph right here that kind of demonstrates with the speed and rapidity of application deployment and the way that we're managing infrastructure across all of these things, right? And how do we keep up with that in security with this manual capability? You kind of see the straight trend line there about manual ability. We're not really getting faster as people. It's sort of the note there, right? But at the same time, we're seeing the other parts of the business as they're automating, really getting, executing quickly. So it creates this gap, this sort of an automation gap there that we've really got to address, by automating pieces of security as well. My colleague Jeff Pollard, did a report a couple of years ago talking about future-proofing your digital business with zero trust, security. And what he did was he looked at enterprises' propensity to adopt cloud environments, right? You can kind of see that on the graph on the left. We saw this really accelerated adoption rate for cloud environments. And you kind of look over to the right and you say, well, where is security placing their bets? Well, security was still placing our bets on on-premise type products and not necessarily cloud-based products, or we're going to secure those cloud environments. So as we're adopting, cloud as a delivery means for the rest of the business, we're kind of going through that digital transformation. We also have to automate, pieces of security to keep up with that. So let's talk a little bit about how we do things today in our security operations. Sort of this, question of SOC inefficiency, right? For one thing, security analysis is a very manual activity. I pointed out before that a lot of our productivity tools are things like, Excel, Notepad, Outlook, Slack, and there's probably a handful of others, but that's what you kind of primarily see in a lot of security operations teams that haven't really embraced doing things in an automated fashion. So we've got to do all of these things, all these analysis activities and pulling information from all of these things here on the right. We do that very much manually by querying or perhaps pivoting, swivel chairing, if you will, into all these different dashboards and screens to go and pull this information together. Even if we're using, a security analytics tool, something like a SIM, we're still bringing in all of this alert information, all these events that we've got to, kind of wade through as security analysts and figure out what's important and what should we really be focusing our time on. And if you've ever seen the old I Love Lucy show, there's a great episode where Ethel here on the left and Lucy here on the right worked in a chocolate factory for a bit, right? And they thought this was going to be a pretty easy gig until the chocolate started coming at them so quickly they couldn't package it up the way they were supposed to. So you see them trying to eat the chocolate. Lucy's trying to shove some chocolate in her shirt and all this kind of stuff. I kind of liken that, to what happens with security analysts. There are things, coming into the SOC so fast that it becomes really difficult to tell what's really important. Where should I spend my time? What do I really need to go and investigate further? And how do I make sure I'm spending the right amount of time on all of these different pieces, right? Very similar to so much coming out at one time that you can't deal with it. If you have not seen this episode, I definitely recommend YouTubing it. It's hilarious. Another problem, we don't really have enough trained people. I think it's actually, probably illegal now to do a security presentation and not mention the cybersecurity staffing shortage. And it's not, maybe even not so much of a staffing shortage as every enterprise is really just struggling finding the right people with the right skill sets to serve their needs, right? That's probably an entirely different conversation about how to hire, retain, and train cybersecurity people. But the fact of the matter is, this is a real thing where we have a lot of SOCs and security teams that are understaffed because we can't find enough people, or there aren't enough people available to fill those seats. So we have to find a way to augment the folks that we do have. Another problem that we have is all of these different security tools that we all have. Because every time a point product or problem came up, what we did was, hey, we went and bought a product for that. We ended up with this really kind of a hodgepodge security tools in a lot of cases, right? Especially really large enterprises may have 30 to 40 different security tools. It's really hard to have expertise on a security team that's deep expertise in all of those tools. And by the way, it's also difficult to have full coverage across the enterprise for all of these tools. So we have to have some way of pulling all of these things together and making them easier to use and easier for our security teams to avail themselves of the data coming from that stuff. So let's talk about how do we improve performance using automation. So probably the first thing we can think about, right, is automation speeds response. It allows us to go and take some automated actions for alert triaging, pulling things together and figuring out, is this attack, real? Is it not real? Is it a false positive or what have you? And can we pull together some additional context around this particular incident that allows us to make a determination about if it's on target, if it's off target, what should our next actions be, et cetera. It helps us to contain outbreaks, whether that's malware outbreaks or if we actually find hacker type activity and contain that in a much faster fashion and get to a point where we can remediate whatever it is. And we'll talk a little bit about some automated response actions and that type of thing. I think the first thing we've got to get over, though, as security people, is that automation isn't a four-letter word. When I first started covering this space about 3 years ago here at Forrester, I encountered a lot of resistance from security people that were not really willing to automate, much of anything, to be honest with you. They felt like this was very much a manual activity that required smart people to be in seats staring at screens and solving problems. Over the last 2 years or so, I think there's been a much higher level of acceptance that, yeah, we can automate some things, right? We can automate some of the tasks that we do because there's really no value added in doing queries, by hand or pulling data by hand or doing context generation by hand, right? It really makes a lot of sense to go and build a playbook around that and then pull that stuff in automatically. And you have to remember, we kind of started this whole presentation off with the concept of the rest of the business have been automating for years. And they're automating at a rate that makes it really hard for us to keep up if we're going to continue trying to do manual analysis on everything, right? So we really have to play a little bit of catch up there. So using automation helps us increase our accuracy, right? Kind of lowers a bit, probably human error, overlooking things that otherwise would not get analyzed at all. It helps us increase our efficiency. It actually creates the ability for us to have some consistency across different people in our security operations team, and therefore also increase our productivity, right? So by pulling in more context, helping to make sure we get the right information to the analyst at the right time, we're actually also able to elevate our less experienced analysts. So kind of addressing some of those problems of having people that aren't quite so experienced by presenting them with the right information and some steps on what to do next as they're working through an investigation. So that also helps to free up some analyst time for automating things that can be automated, reducing human error, and giving us the ability to react more quickly to things that are coming in. One of the things I always get asked, though, is if we have all this automation, are we going to automate away, our people? And you hear some vendors, kind of running around out there, saying, hey, we're going to automate away, this job or that capability. And I don't necessarily see that we're at that stage, right? Instead, this is a tool that works side by side with analysts and helps them, become more productive, not necessarily replacing them. And by the way, let's remember, we're at a deficit right now of analysts. We don't have enough qualified people. So even if we were, to quote unquote replace anybody, right, we're probably going to get right back to a level of stability where we need to be, even if that were the case, right? We have to become more productive. Is sort of the end of that. Another thing that this kind of helps us do is break down the silos. We talk a lot in security and in IT about the silos that exist between security people, endpoint managers, network operators, the CIO's office, help desk, et cetera, right? And trying to get all of these teams to work well together, it can be a challenge. A lot of times it's a political thing more so than it is a technical thing. One of the things that automation kind of requires us to do is to reach across the aisle and have some agreements on, hey, this is how we're going to operate as a team, as a couple of teams. Here are the things we're willing to automate. Here's the way we're going to do handoffs between security and IT, et cetera. And that really sort of forces us to go and have those conversations as opposed to allowing those silos to continue to exist. Anyone who's following the Zero Trust framework, and if you're not familiar with the Zero Trust framework, I definitely recommend that you search Zero Trust, Forrester Zero Trust framework, or go to the Forrester blog site. Some of my colleagues have written some fantastic blogs that talk about Zero Trust and how you can leverage that in your own environment to help become more secure. But one of the core tenets of Zero Trust is automation and orchestration, and that is not only automating some of the back-end processes in a SOC, but it's also automating policies and pushing policy in an automated fashion as opposed to doing it in a much more labor-intensive format. So as you're thinking about hey, we're going to move to a Zero Trust sort of a strategy, think in the back of your head, that means we also need to be embracing automation as a way to enable that Zero Trust strategy. And how do you get started with this? And I know this is sort of a cliche across any technology segment, much less security, but you have to start small. You have to start with the things that are manageable. You have to start someplace where you're going to do little damage, right, and get some experience with automation. And a lot of those things are the repetitive tasks that analysts do. Threat intelligence gathering, pulling data back from different security tools, doing requests from things like EDR tools and others, and pulling those things back and presenting it to an analyst. You can do all of those things in an automated format without endangering anything in your environment, right? That's always the thing in security. Hey, if we automate that, we're going to make a mistake. If we make a mistake, then we're going to shut somebody down. We could shut down a network. We could do something else, that would be a really bad day. But if we're doing these, kind of getting our hands dirty in the background and working on some of these background processes that exist in the SOC, we can gain that experience, gain some confidence, and then we can start working on more advanced automation. Things like remediation activities, saying, hey, if we see something, we have a high degree of confidence that this is a real event and is going to put data at risk, then we want to take an automated action to stop that, right? And that could be something as simple as quarantining a user, or forcing a password reset, or forcing a multi-factor authentication type event. Perhaps blocking an IP address automatically, as opposed to, hey, we're going to open a ticket and say we're going to go block this, right? Let's do it in an automated way, shut it down and investigate it. So now we're reacting to things more quickly instead of letting them kind of linger. So with that, I'm going to wrap up here, right? So I think we've kind of covered off on a few things here. One, security does not have the speed and agility to stop breach activity, especially as attackers are also using their own high degree of automation to come and attack us. Our infrastructure teams, our lines of business operators, our network operators, our cloud teams, et cetera, are all using automation to deploy their workloads, to manage their workloads, to manage the network operations, et cetera. So we've really got to automate to be able to keep up with all those things. This infrastructure complexity of having data all over the place and having applications all over the place kind of necessitates that security also automate to keep up. And by automating, we're increasing our accuracy as security folks, we're increasing our efficiency, and we're increasing our ability to respond quickly to incidents and stop them in their tracks. And with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to hand this off to Joe, who's going to walk us through the remainder of the presentation.
All right, sounds good. I'm going to make you the presenter, Joe.
All right, great. Well, I get this up. Can you guys hear me?
Yep, we can.
All right. All right, I believe that should be up now.
Yep, we can see your slides.
Great. All right, hello everyone, and thanks again for joining. And thank you, JB, for the presentation. I think it could be a nice continuation of what you started here. And so again, I'm Joe Reese, Integrations Product Manager at ThreatConnect, and today I'm going to cover a few things that we're seeing, across our customers and the industry. We're going to cover problems we see. We're going to cover some baby steps to get started with security automation. We're going to cover some pitfalls that we see and how to avoid them. And we're also going to go through a few example solutions using orchestration and automation. So let's start with some problems that we see across customers. And again, a lot of this is going to be, some of this is going to be emphasizing what JB has said and that they're seeing as well, because I think we're all seeing a lot of the same stuff. A lot of it's not new, but I think as we move into looking at automation, it's really important to understand these problems. We have too much data. We have too many alerts. Our teams are over dependent on manual processes. We have this increased complexity that was mentioned, cloud, edge, Internet of Things, and our network perimeters are disappearing quickly. We definitely have too few resources. Resourcing definitely hasn't kept up with the increasing data volume and complexity, but even when we see security budgets growing, we often see that going towards more technology, more tools, which only makes the problem worse. And then something we really see at ThreatConnect is the rapidly changing threat landscape. And so we believe that an effective defense is dependent on your knowledge of an attacker's, methodologies and your ability to really detect it or mitigate it. And our adversaries are rapidly adapting to our defenses, and they're changing their TTPs constantly. If we get good at mitigating or detecting one type of attack, they create a new one. We shut down a malware botnet, they build a new one on new infrastructure. And so also with this increased complexity, there's more opportunity for the good guys to make mistakes. There's a lot of opportunities for someone to forget to do something that was a manual process or to miss a step. And then additionally, there's the fragmentation of people, of process, of technology. Even our security teams themselves are sometimes fragmented, but it's definitely worse between security and infrastructure and other parts of the organization. Our cross-team processes, they're not unified. They typically have clear lines of demarcation where, one team ends and another begins. And then, to make that worse, many of our tools are not integrated over teams or leveraged to their full capacity. So oftentimes relevant data is siloed along with the people who are responsible for it. I just realized I didn't click those slides. So let's move on to some baby steps. How do we get started? What are some things we can do to ease ourselves into automation, to see some value in it, and then to improve upon it? Baby step number one, we can look at automating the security grunt work. So we already talked about how limited our resources are with security people. And so this really comes down to eliminating the work that humans do not need to be doing and let them focus on what they're good at. We're definitely not trying to replace analysts with machines. We're trying to make them more effective and reduce mistakes. We know security people are hard, especially skilled security people. They're high demand, they're hard to find, and they're hard to retain for a variety of reasons. So copying and pasting, downloading, uploading, watching and waiting, these activities, they definitely don't contribute to better metrics or better, ROI. And possibly worse is that these types of activities sap the time, the energy, and even the motivation of our security teams. So basically, how do we start automating some of this grunt work? We suggest starting with things that are repeatable, predictable, and reliable. Also, we can start with quick wins. The low-risk activities that have the most measurable impact to your team for the least amount of effort. Frequently ran but simple processes to execute. This was already mentioned by JB, but things like initial event triage. Analysts are always performing some sort of log and artifact collection. They're always performing artifact enrichment against threat intelligence or other data sources, whether it's a binary file or a user account or asset information. And then additionally, they're always constantly opening cases, updating case info, opening tickets, perhaps requesting another team to perform some other action. These are all routine prescribed actions they're easy to automate, and they're a great starting point when you have the right tools and processes in place. The second baby step would be break down the silos. We constantly see that mature organizations, they establish rules of engagement between their teams, and they unify people and process. Like we had talked about with eliminating the grunt work, a great way to get started here is with low-risk activities, such as ticket management or data collection. And as you continue to orchestrate, so as we see customers continue to orchestrate even more complex processes, they take place as the metrics prove value, as confidence builds across the teams. And on that, then, we believe that it's critical to the success of automation to leverage intelligence and analytics to provide some guardrails for these higher risk processes, especially as you get into containment and remediation. And we'll talk about that in the next baby step. Another way to break down the silos is to integrate technology. So the capability to integrate, and this is near and dear to me with my job, but the capability is rarely the limiting factor. But what I see frequently is that either silos exist between the technologies, it's usually a process or a people type thing that causes there to be this silo, or there's a lack of understanding and awareness of how the tools can complement and benefit each other. And so we can leverage, SOAR to integrate these technologies across environments, whether it's cloud to on-prem or different regions, different business units. For, as an example, ThreatConnect, we enable our customers to scale playbook servers horizontally for performance and availability, but also to reach into isolated environments. We have customers orchestrating entire processes from the cloud that, might require taking an action behind isolated networks in different parts of the world. And then finally on this, we should give teams access to each other's relevant data. And this will normally be facilitated by the integrations we discussed above. Whoops, I went too far on my slide. Sorry about that. There we go. And then the third baby step would be to leverage intelligence and analytics. This was mentioned earlier, but intelligence on an adversary's capabilities, their attack patterns, their intent, all of that should inform how we build and configure our defenses, but especially our orchestration capabilities. With this in mind, we have customers that are building playbooks that can be adaptive to changing adversary capabilities and attack patterns. Something we see happening is, building a playbook to change how you investigate an endpoint based on attack patterns discovered during that initial event triage or alert triage. We see MITRE ATT&CK framework quickly gaining traction across the industry, and it provides a really good standard, a comprehensive standard that is easy to build a playbook around, where you build logic to make a decision based on the type of attack pattern. Another example of this would be changing the priority and actions of a response based on whether a known vulnerability is actively being exploited in the wild or not. There's certainly a different criticality to something that's actively being exploited versus not. And as mentioned also, intelligence and analytics provide guardrails for cross-team rules of engagement and automated actions. So if our intelligence collection indicates an email that a user received, right, it might contain, say the intelligence leads us to believe it contains a zero-day exploit. We might agree to automatically quarantine the host until an investigation takes place. Without that intelligence, we might decide that we can't automatically make that decision to quarantine the host. Or if maybe we have another analytics tool that discovers anomalous user behavior. Maybe the user is, maybe there's activity from the user outside their normal working hours or location. Based on that, we may agree to disable the account, send an account reset automatically. And let's move on to some pitfalls. A couple of pitfalls we see and some ideas to avoid them. Pitfall number one, automation without a call. So this is really a discussion about technology in general probably, but automation, because of how it has to integrate into so many things, into processes, into technologies, it's kind of the epitome of this discussion. But buying a tool without perhaps a clear value proposition, without buy-in from adjacent teams and stakeholders, without access to the necessary data and technology. While this would be a pitfall for any technology purchase, it's a big pitfall for automation. Another pitfall would be, automation without humans in the loop. And to kind of go back to before, we're not trying to get rid of humans. Automation is a tool. It's not a panacea. So we need to move towards more automation, but our analysts are still going to have to make decisions along the way as we move through an investigative process. All right, so how do we avoid some of these pitfalls? Number one, and this is basic security stuff here, but it's easy to be missed as you move into automation. Are manual processes clear and well-defined? Orchestration is only as good as the process it follows. And if you orchestrate a bad process, you're only going to speed up and make more efficient a bad process. It's only going to compound the problem. Number two, know your data and assets. What are you trying to protect? Which assets should take priority? Do you know which systems hold your PII and intellectual property? Do you know which users have access and what controls are in place to protect the critical, your critical data? These questions you should be able to answer them, but they're really important for orchestration because these are typically decision points in your playbooks. A lot of decisions can be made automatically based on the answers to these questions. And then finally, and very importantly, measure effectiveness. So we know that mature organizations look for ways to continually measure their results, and then they're making improvements constantly. So if you're not seeing an ROI with automation or whatever technology, then it's not working right for you. You're doing it wrong. So for example, our customers are measuring the effectiveness of their orchestration through ThreatConnect's built-in ROI calculator and some other metrics to track playbook execution, performance trends, and these things are bubbled up to dashboards for review. Now they're also leveraging our custom metrics feature to track organization and process-specific data. So they can track metrics around their own internal processes, around their own internal organization, specific data, and then use that data to make improvements to their processes, improvements to their playbooks. All right, so let's move into some solutions. And I'm going to cover some example use cases that we've seen across our customers. I'm going to cover some talking points here about the things we've discussed previously around problems. So as you remember from the beginning of the presentation, common problems we're seeing are too much data, too many alerts, increased complexity, too few resources, a rapidly changing threat landscape, and fragmented people, process, and tech. And on these slides, you'll notice that we're outlining the problems that are solved by some of these use cases. So example number one, cloud alert triage. So this playbook is going to triage cloud alerts and response processes across network perimeters. And it's important to kind of highlight here that we're not talking about becoming a SIM or replacing a SIM or anything like that. We believe a SIM or log analytics tool should do what it's good at. But even when those are highly tuned, the amount of alerts they produce can really be overwhelming for our analysts. So how do we solve some of these things? Too many alerts. We're going to orchestrate some of those alert triage processes. We're going to prioritize critical alerts so analysts can look at the most critical events first. Increased complexity. We're orchestrating from a central location, scaling across environments. Too few resources. As discussed earlier, we're automating some of that manual grunt work. Additionally, we're automating the delivery of key insights. And then we're unifying processes across teams and technologies. So this playbook takes critical alerts and they're parsed and saved in ThreatConnect for analysis. Those parsed artifacts are analyzed automatically by the playbook. If there are any hits indicating some suspicious activity or relationship, we're going to automatically open a case and save the results for further investigation. And the playbook may also open a case if the asset involved is of a certain criticality, even if nothing malicious is found. And from there, we can trigger additional investigative actions across cloud and on-prem solutions based on the findings. The next example is an account reset orchestration. And this is a good example of, orchestrating a simple process across teams, across technologies, but it happens, these are the types of things that happen quite frequently. So we're solving here for too many alerts. We're automating a simple, repeatable process. We're solving for too few resources by reducing response time, minimizing user impact. And this process starts with a SIM rule that detects anomalous user behavior. It's going to automatically disable the user's account and send a password reset email. It's going to also collect the user and asset information from internal databases and open a case and save that information for further review. Now, with the right process in place, you might actually be able to do this without an analyst ever reviewing it. You might be able to just close the case with automated processes, but that could be a follow-on action. And finally, here to wrap up, and this example is a little more detailed, let's look at an endpoint investigation orchestration. So we're solving for all the same problems as before, but we're also going to solve for a rapidly changing threat landscape. We're going to adapt this playbook to the changing, TTPs that the adversary might be using. So this starts with an alert that is received for a suspicious running process. So the playbook's going to isolate the endpoint during the investigation. It's going to get the file automatically from the endpoint. It's going to send it out to our malware sandbox tool. Those results are going to be saved in ThreatConnect, and our playbook then can tell whether there's a connection to a specific threat group or other incidents or any other data that intelligence that's in ThreatConnect. The collected intelligence is going to indicate in this that the threat is known to target specific CVEs and perhaps has additional indicators of compromise that it's known to have used in the past, right? And so what our process can do here is several things with this information. We can check our vulnerability scan results to validate the host is not vulnerable to those known exploits. I would hope that this has already taken place as part of a separate, maybe proactive threat intel to vulnerability management process. But with vulnerability scans running, 24 hours, maybe longer apart, it's good to validate that kind of stuff as part of a process if it's easy to do. And additionally, we can check our EDR tools and scan the host for any activity related to the associated indicators we found in ThreatConnect. And then based on the results of those, we can trigger additional playbooks to perform follow-on actions, before an analyst ever gets involved. This stuff could happen just dynamically based on the fact that there was a positive result in the vulnerability scanning tool or the EDR solution. And then obviously the playbook will open a case, if it's not already, and save those results so that an analyst can review them in detail. All right, that is all I have. Thank you all for watching and listening. I'll hand this back over to Jessica for some questions, I believe.
Yep, thank you, Joe. I'm going to take it back here. Okay, let's move on to some questions. Thank you again, JB and Joe. Very interesting stuff. All right, first question. This all seems very dependent on integrations. Flexibility when it comes to integration capabilities is key, I'm assuming. What are the types of mechanisms in place with an automation solution to allow for flexible integrations? That comes from Mike.
Sure, so I can take...
Yeah, Joe, you want to take a stab at it? I can jump in on top.
Yeah, that's fine. So yeah, I was going to say that, I think so for ThreatConnect at least, we allow, so our customers are able to build applications to run. We have an app builder in the platform that they can build and write their own applications and their custom, scripts to take action within an orchestration. That is a more complex thing to do, but I think it's really important that we allow users to do this very easily. So for instance, I can go into ThreatConnect and build a playbook to reach out to an API, download the results, parse the data, and take follow-on actions without writing a single line of code. And I can do that within minutes using a built-in HTTP client, a JSON parser, and other utilities that are built into the orchestration tool. And I think that's really important for allowing our teams to get up and get running, because not everybody knows how to write code, but a lot of people know how to build or how they want their processes to work, and they understand APIs and data fields and things like that. So we make it very easy to do that, whether writing code or not. And we see a lot of success with that with our customers who are building just things left and right to automate their own processes. JB, did you want to add more to that?
Yeah, I think the other piece of that is, taking advantage of all the APIs that are available, not only in the automation tool, but also natively in the other security tools that you're working with. One of the things I think that's been a big change in information security or cybersecurity tools over the last, maybe 5+ years or so is the fact we've opened them up. We used to have a very closed environment, and one of the things we had to do to enable, this type of automation was open the tools up so that vendors like ThreatConnect can actually interact with all the security tools that are, native in your environment. So I think that's been a key part of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point.
Good point. Okay, let's see. Next question. This one comes from Charles. Earlier in the presentation, you brought up horizontal scaling. Can you review this in a little more detail? What type of use case would call for this?
Yeah, so I'll jump on that. I think, for horizontal scaling, I'm talking more about high availability as well as kind of quality of service. So we allow customers to scale playbook workers, if you will. The orchestration is taking place from a central location, but you can stand up multiple workers, as many as you want, and those workers can be assigned to a generic queue. They can be assigned to only high priority, actions. They can be reserved for critical processes. So you might have, 2 workers that are working through a generic queue of actions that could, might have a time delay on it because there's such a backlog. But you might have this separate worker that only is always on the ready, always ready to fire off that critical action that needs to take place immediately. But it's just in general, we have customers performing, thousands, if not tens of thousands of actions per day. Scaling horizontally is really important for that to be successful.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Next question. I agree with a lot of these points, but how do we get management on board with this initial investment?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on that one, Jessica. One of the things that has been fairly common with the inquiries that I've taken from Forrester customers has been a lot of these automation initiatives actually get started by the management team. One of the things that we're seeing in some cases is security professionals or CISOs being asked kind of prove what you're doing in security and to get more effective across the organization. And one of the things that they've turned to are automation platforms, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One, if you're automating things, you're obviously becoming more efficient and you're sort of mimicking other parts of the business. Another, and I think Joe touched on this a little bit in his presentation, but it also enables better reporting. One of the things we're not really so good at a lot of the time in security operations is reporting on our effectiveness and reporting on our productivity level and so forth. One of the things with automation is it provides us the ability to have a closed loop between the time we do a detection through the investigation process up until the point that we actually close out whatever the incident was or the event was. And that enables us to look at things like, where were we getting value? What security tools were giving us value? What threat intelligence sources were giving us value? How effective was the individual analyst at studying this problem? How quickly were we able to resolve the root cause of the problem? And we were able to really kind of look at those things, examine them, trend them. And I think that's some of the capability that we can demonstrate back to management to say, hey, we're going to accelerate our ability to respond to things. That's a big, big management thing. Decreasing risk is a big management thing. I think kind of talking in the vernacular that management teams and CFOs like to hear, things like risk reduction, increased efficiency, et cetera. And then we can prove that through measurement and reporting is really, really important.
All right. Thank you, JB. That is all the questions we have coming in right now. If anyone does have any questions, feel free to reach out. Just checking one more time. And thank you again so much, JB, for speaking with us today. Thank you, Joe. And I hope everyone enjoyed the webinar, and we will see you all next time.